My life took a turn for the bizarre when I bought my first house. The neighborhood was perfect. The house was a dream. But there was one tiny little problem: the HOA. At first, it was the usual stuff: lawn length regulations, trash can placement protocols, the color of your garden gnomes. You know the drill. Annoying but manageable. I mostly kept to myself, paid my dues on time, and tried to stay off their radar. I figured as long as I followed the rules, we'd be fine. Oh, how wrong I was. The story really begins a few months after I moved in. I started getting these weird emails from the HOA, not the usual newsletters about bake sales or neighborhood watch meetings. These were different. They were addressed to the event coordinator and talked about booking dates, vendor lists, and catering options for something called the Grove View Manor. I had no idea what Grove View Manor was. I replied to the first email saying they probably had the wrong address. I got a curt response back: please stick to the approved vendor list. Further questions should be directed to the HOA board. Okay, weird, but whatever. I ignored it. Then the letter started. Formal-looking invitations began showing up in my mailbox, addressed to guests of weddings and parties at, you guessed it, Grove View Manor, and the address listed on these fancy invitations. It was my address, my house. My quiet little slice of suburbia was apparently a premier wedding venue, and nobody had bothered to tell me. I was floored. I immediately called the HOA president, a woman named Karen. Of course, I told her, Karen, you're sending wedding invitations with my address on them. What is going on? She laughed, a condescending high-pitched laugh. She told me that the previous owner had rented out the property for events, and the house's community-designated name was the Grove View Manor. She said it was a long-standing neighborhood tradition and significant source of community funding. I was speechless. I told her I was the new owner, and my house was absolutely not for rent. It was my private home. Karen's tone changed instantly. She became cold and dismissive. She said the HOA bylaws allowed them to utilize designated community assets for fundraising, and that my property was one of them. She basically told me it was my duty to the community to host these events. I checked my paperwork, my deed, every single document I signed. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that said my home was a community event hall or that the HOA had any right to use it. They had completely made it up. So, I did what any sane person would do. I sent a Sasandist letter through my lawyer. It was crystal clear. My property is private. You have no right to schedule events here. Stop all advertising and cancel all bookings immediately. I thought that would be the end of it. Illegal letter should scare them straight, right? Wrong again. A week later, a giant white tent appeared in my backyard. I came home from work to find a full-on wedding setup taking over my lawn. Tables, chairs, floral arrangements, a dance floor, the whole 9 yards. I lost it. I called the police. When the officer arrived, Karen was already there smooing with the wedding party. She showed the officer a forged document, a supposed agreement signed by the previous owner. The officer was confused. He said it was a civil matter and he couldn't just kick everyone out. He suggested I take it to court. The wedding was scheduled for the next day. I felt completely powerless. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was pacing my living room, looking out at the circus in my backyard, feeling my blood boil. They were trespassing. They were using my home, my sanctuary against my will, and the law was shrugging its shoulders. And then an idea sparked. It was a wild, crazy, probably terrible idea, but it was also perfect. My backyard had this old dilapidated shed that was there when I bought the place. It was an eyesore filled with rust and junk. On my home inspection report, it was listed as a tear-down structure. I had been meaning to get rid of it for months. The next morning, the day of the wedding, I made a phone call. I found a local demolition company that did emergency same-day jobs. I explained the situation, emphasizing that I needed a structure on my own property taken down, and I needed it done. Today, I paid a hefty rush fee, but the guy on the phone just said, "No problem, ma'am. We'll be there this afternoon." The wedding was scheduled for 3 p.m. The demolition crew was scheduled for 2 p.m. At 1:45 p.m., a massive flatbed truck carrying a bulldozer rumbled down my street. You could see the panic on the faces of the caterers and florists setting up under the tent. Karen came running over. Her face beat red. "What is the meaning of this? You can't do this. We have a wedding in an hour." I just smiled and held up my phone, showing her the approved demolition permit from the city I had secured weeks ago, but never acted on. Just some light home improvement. "Karen," I said, "don't worry, it's my property. I'm allowed." The bulldozer operator was a true artist. He expertly navigated the machine right to the edge of the pristine white tent, then swung around and positioned himself in front of the ugly old shed. The wedding guests had started to arrive, dressed in their finest, only to be greeted by the sight of heavy machinery poised for destruction. The bride and groom pulled up in a limo, looked at the scene, and just stared in disbelief. Then the magic happened. With a roar of the engine, the bulldozer went to work. The old shed splined and crashed. Dust and debris went flying. It was loud, it was messy, and it was glorious. The noise was deafening. The ground shook. It was the absolute opposite of a serene wedding atmosphere. Guests were backing away, covering their ears. The bride was in tears. Karen was screaming, but you couldn't hear her over the beautiful symphony of destruction. The demolition crew took their sweet time. They made sure every last piece of that shed was reduced to rubble, then slowly loaded it all into a dump truck. By 4:00 p.m., the wedding was obviously canceled. The caterers were packing up, the guests were leaving, and the happy couple was having a very unhappy argument on the sidewalk. Karen just stood there amidst the tire tracks and the dust, looking utterly defeated. The aftermath was epic. The HOA was sued by the wedding party for the canceled event. They tried to countersue me, but my case was airtight. I had a permit. It was my property, and they were the ones trespassing. They ended up having to pay a massive settlement to the family, which nearly bankrupted the entire HOA. Karen was voted out in a landslide at the next emergency meeting. The new HOA board sent me a formal written apology. And you know what? My backyard has never looked better. Sometimes you have to fight fire with a bulldozer. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories.